as thanks for the introduction. My name's Gilbert, and in terms of my background, I founded and ran a London tech agency for 10 years. And it's actually there that I became fascinated by this relationship which GDPR represents between data, which we all use, and regulation. And I ended up pivoting that business into one of the first PrivTech firms, providing cookie consent solutions. So that technology now, cookie banners, automated audits, runs some of the world's biggest websites. And that sort of really opened my eyes to the opportunities around privacy and doing the right thing by data. And I ended up selling that business to OneTrust and then providing consultancy to brands and organizations around GDPR and increasingly around data ethics. As you mentioned, I'm now CEO of Tap My Data, which is a blockchain startup which builds tools for people to take back control of their data. And I'm really happy to share a few insights and trends today around GDPR and privacy from a consumer point of view, and look at which companies are getting with the program, and also about dealing with a data crisis. And finally, I'll talk about what I think are some really game-changing developments, and I'll be delighted to take questions. And the question I hear most from normal people talking about privacy is my phone listening to me? If so, who's listening? Well, we know that Alexa is. And actually, if someone in the audience now can help, it would be really useful to know the answer to the question in this meme. I've only got a pet rabbit at home who's hopping about now at the moment, so I can't test this unless the pancake's are carrot flavored. So let me know in the chat or at the end. It's true, though, that technology has driven the data explosion, with most of it created post-GDPR in the last 2 years. This has only increased with COVID lockdown. The number of US consumers handing their information to e-commerce sites surged by 60% in lockdown. We've all, to a certain extent, lost control. And companies' lakes of personal data, which we saw as assets, are now turning toxic, with rising fines and data rights being weaponized. So where are we now, and why is there such concern? After all, we've got GDPR and now CCPA in the US and California to help regulators police data, right? Well, the fact is that while regulation moves at one speed, technological progress is much faster and increasing exponentially. Now, here's an image of the Lumascape, which, as many of you will know, is the map of publishers, intermediaries, and platforms which exist between brands who want eyeballs on their products and the consumers of content online. Now, this was back in 2010. And here's the Lumascape in 2019. So that we can see that despite the arrival of GDPR, new platforms, types of data from wearables like my Fitbit, and greater granularity have created an explosion of intermediaries. Now, the complexity of this ecosystem and these mostly automated practices long ago exceeded the capacity of the human brain to understand them in detail. And in that space, doubt, uncertainty, and conspiracy theories can grow. Now, the idea that phones are bugging us when we talk about, say, pet food, and then we get served ads online for, dog food or kitty munch is denied by phone manufacturers and platforms. And I believe them. They argue quite reasonably that they've got enough data points from web usage, loyalty programs, and past transactions to predict what we want when we want it. But it's still an uncanny feeling. And as these figures show, there's growing concern amongst consumers around online privacy and the transaction, the deal around their data that takes place when their data is captured, shared, and used. In particular, we can see that 78% of people believe that businesses get the best deal from data exchange, and a majority of people fear they've lost control of their personal data. Now, if there's proof or a suspicion that their data is being used to deny them access to products and opportunities which make their life better, like a bank loan or a job, then this concern could quickly erupt into anger and destroy businesses or other types of organization potentially overnight. And this filters through into businesses' relationships with the public around their data. things like rights requests are treated as weapons of the aggrieved, like ex-employees or a hacker or an investigative journalist. Um, and regulators can appear outgunned or even captured by huge firms. And we all kind of click on web banners without believing that our consent is really being respected. So how do we de-risk this data? Well, as a technologist and an optimist, I believe that businesses who get serious about their responsibilities with data, ethics, and doing the right thing now, post GDPR, will find it starts to bring real commercial benefits too. So how do we reset this relationship? Well, after GDPR, business as usual has been forever disrupted. And the way most companies and their advisors have dealt with this is, understandably, to focus on a narrow set of compliance obligations. It's much harder to answer the question which now starts to nag at us. Just because something is technically possible with data and currently legal, is it the right thing to do? Now, this is where ethics starts to come in. And despite being dismissed in some areas as sort of whitewashing commercial practices or even dumbed down law, it's getting increasing traction both academically and at boardroom level as a means to move beyond compliance towards a roadmap for doing the right thing and operationalizing privacy. So let's examine the options. Well, the first thing we'll want is some kind of framework. Now, an ethical framework is a set of codes that an individual uses to guide his or her behavior. An example could be the 10 Commandments in Christianity. Now, many companies have started to adapt or develop their own framework, and there's about 70 of these out there at the moment. And these are pretty high level, but they're a good set of general questions with which to engage the C-suite and other key stakeholders, get on the record with consumers, and move the whole issue out of the compliance zone. And these are also things to which you can and should apply the same rigor and measurement as you do for production output and financial results. So this isn't sort of ethical hand-wringing or do-goodery, it's commercial sense, and smart brands get this. So here's an example. Earlier this year, IKEA's chief digital officer in Europe, not their compliance head, appeared in a video explaining how they embed data ethics into everything they do, what they call a people-centric approach. Now, IKEA worries that many companies operate as if customers' personal data was their own property, and they stress the need to rethink everything they do through the lens of data ethics. Now, to this end, IKEA launched the Customer Data Promise, which is a first step on its journey to develop a set of principles and approach to how it uses data. Now, the aim here is to ensure that it's putting people first in all data-driven processes and have this as a business KPI, a key performance indicator. Now, it's important to stress that there isn't a revolutionary process. IKEA's approach is to provide a series of preference centers for customers to view, correct, and control their details while still keeping them safely on the company's digital estate, be that a website or a mobile app. Now, whether this is going to evolve into true control for citizens over data is still to be seen, but IKEA is putting themselves in a good place as being along for this journey. Now, another key area where a business can distinguish itself is in how it behaves in a crisis. Now, we're all handling such a volume of data with so many counterparties that sadly, it's not a question of if so much as when a breach, human error, or other similar incident occurs. Now, we've seen Zoom explode. Zoom is now a verb. It's grown from 10 million to over 200 million daily users in just a few months, according to the Financial Times. And see here just how quickly Zoom responded to concerns around security and privacy, things like Zoom bombing and what was happening to the data that was being captured in calls. Now, their chief executive went quickly on the record with a public apology, and we've all seen that now they're on an active, almost daily release cycle to get their house in order. And to be fair, Zoom's been around since 2011, so it's unsurprising that a lot of its default architecture was set to acquire data about users, which could in turn be sort of vacuumed up into the ad tech ecosystem we were looking at a moment ago. Data capture and lock-in was seen as desirable for startups and how we all used to build web applications. Now, I think it's fair to say that Zoom has restored trust and is getting back to building traction, partly because they've got a strong enough business use case to make aggressive data monetization unnecessary. They're also able to make the point that we may all have to sacrifice some convenience for doing the right thing by data. So and apologies for the silly meme. So what's the front line emerging in all this? It's the lowest common denominator, the subject access request, or the DSAR, the data subject access request. Now, since GDPR, complaints to the ICO, the UK regulator, as just one regulator, about organisations have risen over 100%. And the top category is around responses to requests. Now, one of the tricky things about GDPR is the inherent tension between the rights of the individual, which I think we all agree are a good thing, and the responsibilities and rights of organisations to protect the security of data, their own interests, and not to be sort of hassled by long-bearded privacy freaks. Now, in the absence of prescriptive guidance from regulators, the de facto process for SARs relies on the subject, that's the consumer, knowing which companies have their data, following each of their processes, and meeting their demands. It's a really manual process of attrition in terms of getting their data, which damages trust on both sides. So how can we improve on this? Well, at Tap My Data, as a startup, we had a rare opportunity to build a consumer-focused PrivTech product and platform using privacy by design principles from the ground up, without any legacy architecture. So we built a mobile app for citizens to discover which organizations hold their data, make subject requests, repatriate that data to their phones, and store it securely in a data wallet. The other element here is to build a secure channel for people and organizations to engage in a dialogue, a conversation around their data and their rights. So all good, yeah? Well, actually, the problem here is that we need to rethink our basic approach to building apps and systems. And some of you here may recognize the scene and the obnoxious boss from cult movie Office Space. I think it was back in the late 90s. It's really worth a watch. It's about disenfranchised techies in a software company who go rogue with the company's data in like spectacular fashion. And for technologists, developers, and data entrepreneurs, the default has long been to capture all the data, store it, and work out what to do with it later. And this attitude has reached its logical conclusion with the business of Facebook and others, and pressure is growing with a steady stream of breaches we hear from the media, and now fines. So in the space of just a few weeks last year, the UK ICO announced intention to fine British Airways and Marriott Hotels a total of almost 300 million for breached data. So without this baggage, we took the 7 principles of privacy by design founded by Dr. Ann Cavoukian and boiled them down to 2 simple operating practices. The first one being collect as little data as possible from a user in the first place, and secondly, don't hold anything personal that isn't encrypted. So our first challenge with the app, users generally need profiles, and user profiles need data. Now, common practice says that we need to collect an email and a password. Now, this immediately violates principle 1 of collecting as little data as possible and strongly leans towards violating point 2 at the same time. So what's our solution? Well, we generate a user profile on the fly without intervention. We assign a random garbage email address to you and create a super secure password that you'll never know and never need. You haven't given us any data. You have an account. Your app can log in. We have no idea who you are because we don't want your data. So having built this foundation, how do we embrace new tech safely, namely blockchain? After all, there's been a lot of contentious debate which continues along the lines that blockchain and privacy don't mix. Now, the best way in my mind for this context is to think of blockchain as a tally stick, a notice board of activity. So if we take this approach and use the blockchain here not to store data, but rather as the record of data transactions, it starts to make sense. Now, we use Stellar which is an open source decentralized blockchain. Now, this provides a public ledger that allows transactions between two or more parties, so that when a user makes a data request to an organization, a record of this transaction, but no personal data, is recorded on the public ledger, and when an organization responds too. Now, one of the current challenges with GDPR compliance and data governance is that each organization effectively marks their own homework in terms of responses to data subject rights. Now, using the blockchain as a mechanism for transacting the requests and responses in hashed form, we're building up a central permanent record which can be accessed and interrogated by third parties such as a regulator or an external auditor, without compromising security or privacy. And on the topic of security, without it, there is by definition no privacy. And what we're doing with Tap My Data is setting up a secure peer-to-peer channel for data dialogue between individuals and organizations. The way we do this is by using a process of public key cryptography. And I'll keep this brief, but the process goes something like this. So in this case, Alice wants to send Bob some data securely. Alice takes the public key from Bob, which is a bit that Bob can divulge to anyone, and she encrypts it using a given encryption algorithm, known as a cipher. Bob can then decrypt that data using his private key. Now, this is a bit that he should never divulge to anyone, and the same cipher. And voila, it's now plain text between the two actors. So Tap My Data has provided the framework for this without putting any of the data in our own hands and raising our risk profile. It's a data Faraday cage. The security now largely comes down to key management. And what we've discovered in the real world is that key management is hard. Now, with around 500 organizations using our channel, our biggest overhead in terms of support is dealing with situations where they've lost their secure key. And they find it hard to understand at first that we can't tell them what their key passphrase is, we don't have an admin password, and we don't have a God view of users of the system. And this reinforces a point I made earlier that we will need to sacrifice some convenience, at least in the short term, as individuals and organizations. And there's no way of getting around this. And there's no way of getting around this. If you want to use privacy by design to safely engage with sexy new tech like blockchain, AI, and the rest, well, fine, but you need to plan and budget up front for at least 50% more time, planning and resourcing to get it right. And short term, you also need to educate staff, partners, and customers on the responsibilities of doing the right thing in the same way you did back in 2018 with your GDPR programs. And as I mentioned before, this pays dividends. Just as GDPR raised the profile and concerns of people in organizations who are the guardians of security, privacy by design chimes with the belief systems of developers. They get this, and it's great to see them rise to the challenge. Within my own team, I've seen this. And the nice thing also is this makes you super prepared with external tests of your operational fitness. So for example, we welcome receiving SARs at Tap My Data, and we do get quite a few. And when we get an email asking us to delete the data we have on someone, we're able to answer truthfully and with certainty that until we receive this email, we had no data on you, but we'll be happy to delete this email now and let you get on with your life. So I think it's fair to say that until now, it's been the case, firstly, that the burden for operational and technical compliance and best practice has fallen upon each business to ensure they're up to scratch. Now, this means a lot of smaller and medium-sized companies are not fully in compliance or even in ignorance of their responsibilities. And secondly, there's been a lack of consumer-grade tech for people to exercise their choice and rights over their data. Things like email, web forms, and Dropbox-style methods are still the norm, which aren't secure and don't scale and breaks the customer experience. Now, this is now starting to be addressed as more core providers bake privacy by design into their tech stack, And you see things like proper granular consent management and consent management tracking gain traction, and investment grows into PrivTech. So in 2019, there was 70 billion invested in this space. Now, I think this is going to raise the overall levels of best practice, and we have to mean that we'll rely less on individuals doing the right thing every time. And there are even efforts to reduce the 99 articles, elements of GDPR, to a single API, or even a line of code for developers, or a smart contract in a blockchain context, which is exciting but a lot more challenging. So I think this is going to reduce the pressure on individual companies and also create a privacy stack where consumers start to make choices based on privacy and a clean data basis. And we're seeing the beginnings of this with the likes of Brave and DuckDuckGo. And we're also seeing the arrival of what I call nuisance tech, which are sort of attempts to bombard companies with requests for deletion of a right to be forgotten as a prelude to legal action. Again, automation is a really good way to mitigate that challenge. So we already talked about the need to be mindful of the data that we process, i.e. capture, store, and eventually dispose of. Another feature of how modern businesses operate is the need to share data with third parties and to blend data to create more value downstream, which is using the kind of overused data is oil analogy. And I should point out that with the term pet trends, I don't mean all the people who bought cute puppies during COVID lockdown. Privacy enhancing technologies, PETs, are a broad range of technologies that are designed to extract data value in order to unleash its full commercial, scientific, and social potential without risking the privacy and security of this information, which makes them super relevant right now. And given the time, I'm just going to focus on a couple. Pseudonymization and anonymization are techniques for de-risking data which have existed for a while but have become even more popular post-GDPR. But there's no silver bullet when it comes to data security. Despite any measures you put in place, you can re-identify pseudonymous data precisely because it's a reversible process. And neither is data anonymization a fail-safe option. A few years back, AOL, Netflix, and the New York Taxi Commission all released anonymized data sets to the public. Subsequently, external actors were able to identify individuals in each data set. And that also happened more recently in Australia. However, implemented well, both pseudonymization and anonymization have their uses. I personally think that they should be used hand in hand with a data minimization approach to new and existing tech and processes, as I just showed with Tap My Data. Now, cryptographic algorithms play an increasing role in this space. Now, differential privacy protects from organizations sharing any information about individuals. And this cryptographic algorithm adds basically, a statistical white noise layer to personally identifiable information, which enables us to describe patterns of groups within the data set while maintaining the privacy of individuals. And synthetic data is artificially created data used by using different algorithms, including machine learning algorithms. So if you're interested in privacy enhancing technologies because you need to transform your data into an environment where third-party users have access, generating synthetic data that has the same statistical characteristics is a great option. And this means that you can put it to collective use and potential insights without the owner's efforts in gathering it being commercially devalued. And tellingly, the EU is using this movement to strike out at some of these gatekeeper platforms like Google and Amazon, their use of proprietary data, and to demand a level playing field. So we see, just like GDPR, regulation continues to play a role in accelerating these trends. And we talked earlier about the belief systems of developers and also about how companies are adapting and adopting ethical frameworks which they can apply on a pan-regional or even a global basis. And obviously with GDPR, much of its detail and definitions could be found in previous regulations, but what is new is the principle of accountability. Now, accountability can be boiled down to not just complying, but demonstrating that you thought through the risks and responsibilities around data and communicated this to people inside and beyond the organisation. And the UK regulator, the ICO, has gone on the record saying this is the most important thing for companies to get right. And a key person in bridging this gap between what the business wants from data and what it should be doing is the data protection officer, which is a new role created by the GDPR. Now, a DPO acts as the internal watchdog for the business, and there was a lot of excitement about this initially in 2018, and predictions of something like 30,000 of these DPOs being needed with big salaries and a hiring boom. And this hasn't really happened. Many companies have tended to add this to the responsibilities of an existing staff member or outsource this to an external third party, like a law firm. And the pool of data protection professionals hasn't really grown. So I think as a PrivTech stack matures and GDPR compliance gets more automated and complicated, we should widen remit to make it more of a role for someone with a technical or a security background, as they've already got the skills. And similarly, while it's obviously not a proxy for GDPR compliance, getting serious about operational efficiency and security around data by achieving and maintaining ISO certification is a really good way to demonstrate a commitment to GDPR. I'm mindful of the time, and as I mentioned, I think we're moving out of this compliance phase of data safety, and there's a couple of real big events on the landscape. The first is the arrival of class action lawsuits from the US around recent data breaches. Now, this shows people using GDPR rights to build cases and law firms representing them. We're also seeing the EU itself pivot its focus away from protecting individual privacy to responsible data sharing as a civic duty, and actually launching a market for personal data in the next 2 years. So just a couple of takeaways there in summary. But I mean, I think, looking at data privacy and GDPR not as a compliance obligation, but an opportunity to rebuild trust, both and break down barriers within the organization, it's a golden opportunity. So I'll leave it at that. If happy to answer any questions in remaining time.
Yeah, we have 2 minutes, just 2 minutes. I don't see any questions from the audience, but I have a lot. I'm not sure that I will have time to ask all of them. But so maybe I will start from those slides, which was about Lumascape 2019, right? With a big number of items. And so you mentioned explosion of intermediaries provokes challenges for the whole industry. Just my question, is it potential data breach or threat or not? And yesterday also, I will just explain all my idea or my question, maybe you will answer afterwards. Just yesterday, I participated at Cyber's conference, which is financial focused, all the questions were around intermediaries as well. And if you know David Birch, he was also 2 days ago here as a speaker. His idea is to cut all those intermediaries and to go to peer-to-peer and as well. So you also mentioned on another slide the privacy keys and so on, and so different scam as well, how to cooperate to each other and to share the data. But I'm not sure that Facebook, for example, could implement those approach. So the question, what is the core idea for the world of future, I would say, to cut the number of intermediaries or to go in the technological way and to change the philosophy, how to build those data sharing?
Wow, that's a really excellent question. It covers a lot of ground. In terms of the trend is definitely to cut down that forest of intermediaries. But it's the only comparison is with financial services. That there's the human brain can't comprehend that much detail. So both the clients and a lot of those intermediaries themselves don't really understand what is happening with the data. That means each of those is a source of risk. Mm-hmm. So we're seeing brands like FMCG brands who've got a strong customer base actually start to move away from intermediaries to having their own databases and engaging with people directly. And we've also seen Google outlaw the use of third-party cookies within 2 years. So again, you're seeing companies like Google act almost like regulators. Where this leads Facebook is a different question, and Facebook is kind of is sort of social plumbing, and I think there's lots of people who would like to emulate their business model in terms of how people will navigate this. I think the move very much is towards people having their own kind of preference center and engaging with organizations when they choose to. So yeah, when my car breaks down, I'm really receptive to talking to breakdown repairers right now, and I will open my consent and my ports, and I'll probably do that via my handset. So we're also seeing people like Apple move to own more of that relation, act as a kind of a concierge or a guardian. So I think, you're right. The intermediaries will be chopped down, and people will want to play more of a role. Because the thing is that if I control my data, I start to clean my data, and I start to feel a connection with it, which I don't do at the moment. We click on things and we don't know where the data goes, and that's not tenable in the medium to long term.
If you consider those Facebook, I don't have any other way just to post the announcement and hello Facebook, I don't allow you to do something like that. But so it's not the choice. It's not the case. It doesn't help. And I understand that it's like fiction, right? So maybe in the future, people will choose particular social media platforms where the data is more in privacy and secured and something like that. Maybe.
Yes, I think you're right. And I think what's also changing is that GDPR Article 20 is being looked at, so that will demand that companies, including Facebook, have an API. So at the moment, it's difficult to replicate Facebook. I can do the functionality, but not the data. Mm-hmm. In the future, with people's permission, I'll be able to take all my data from Facebook and populate a new privacy-centric framework, which is going to be a big source of opportunity for new companies.
Yeah, Gilbert, thank you so much. So amazing presentation and a lot of ideas to discuss. So I hope we will have time for a coffee break and to take a seat on the table in our platform.
Absolutely.
And thanks a lot. And we are happy.
You.
Thank you and have a nice day. Thanks again for joining us.